Thanks everyone for being here. This is not my typical crowd, so it's been really interesting to see all the talks today and get a new perspective on AI. And I'm guessing as a result, also this talk will be very different from most of the other talks today. So I'm going to be talking about this paper with a number of co-authors shown here on the slide called The Uneven Impact of Generative AI on Entrepreneurial Performance. To start by just stating in very plain, sort of reduced form terms what this paper is doing, the question that we're trying to ask is, what is the causal effect of giving small, medium business entrepreneurs in Kenya access to generative AI? And the way that we're going to answer this question is by running an RCT in Kenya with about 600 small business owners across the entire country. We're going to give half of them access to a generative AI-based tool, and the other half are not going to have access to that tool. So that's what we're doing. You might wonder, why is this an interesting thing to do? Why is this question something that we would care about answering? Let me spend a couple of minutes giving you two different sort of justifications for why we would want to know the answer to this question. First is just that entrepreneurship is an interesting thing to study. The reasons for that is that it's difficult to do. One of the big sources of the difficulty in being an entrepreneur is that it's very difficult to know ex ante if your business venture is going to succeed. A big driver of that is the fact that entrepreneurship is inherently multidimensional, right? So entrepreneurs have to do everything. They're wearing a bunch of hats. They're juggling a bunch of different tasks. Entrepreneurship requires a lot of complements. You need financial capital. You perhaps need a social network to get connections to achieve whatever it is that you're trying to do. Because you're juggling all these hats and doing all these different tasks, entrepreneurs are susceptible to inattention, right? So they often do not pay attention to the right things. They often miss important pieces of information. As a result of all these different factors, most firms, whether it's VC-based companies here in the US or the small, medium businesses in Kenya that we're studying in this context, ultimately stagnate and fail. Despite all this, there's a lot of research that shows that advice can actually help entrepreneurs be successful. So they don't always get that advice, but when they do, it helps. And there's a lot of different evidence for this across a bunch of different literatures, papers looking at markets for judgment, peer learning and networking among social networks, formal mentorship and training programs. All these different literatures show that when you give entrepreneurs advice to help them run their business, it generally helps them succeed. And so a natural question to ask, given the sort of potential impact of advice, is, can generative AI advise entrepreneurs, right? So can we give people access to this tool, and then rather than getting advice from a human, they get advice from AI? And if you think about it, even if the impact of giving people AI-based advice is much smaller in magnitude than the impact of human-based advice, this can potentially scale up much more quickly than matching people with human mentors. And so you could quickly help millions of businesses all over the world if AI advice is in fact effective. So that's one reason this is interesting to study, just thinking about the impact of this sort of global intervention to help small business owners and entrepreneurs succeed. A second reason that this is an interesting question to ask is sort of plugging into this emerging literature on the economic impacts of AI and specifically generative AI. So there's been a bunch of recent research looking at generative AI in particular and looking at the impact that it has on productivity and output. And these papers have typically focused on well-defined tasks that are writing-based in nature, right? So the Nguyen Zhang paper here looks at workers on Upwork who are writing pieces of text. The Brynjolfsson, Lee, and Raymond paper looks at call center workers who are responding to customer inquiries. And the Delacqua and co-authors paper looks at BCG consultants who are doing management consulting tasks. So in all cases, these are text-based tasks where the person is writing or responding with some piece of text. So in all these papers, it's a singular task, right? So there's only one task being done. As I mentioned, these are writing-based tasks, so the output of the AI can, in theory, just be copy and pasted to complete the task. These are tasks that do not require any complements, right? So you don't need financial capital, you don't need access to a social network, and here the outcomes for these tasks are occurring outside of the market, right? So the different workers are not competing with other workers to determine whether or not they succeed. If you think about entrepreneurship as a task, it is opposite to all these tasks and basically every single one of these dimensions that I've mentioned, right? So entrepreneurship is not a singular task. As I mentioned, it's this bundle of tasks. And so the way that the entrepreneurs choose to use the AI is this kind of messy endogenous process where they could use it for marketing, they could use it for sales, they could use it for pricing. Who knows what they'll use AI for? The entrepreneurs actually have to go and implement the advice that they're given by AI. They can't just copy and paste advice that's given to them. As I've mentioned about entrepreneurship a couple of slides ago, there are tons of compliments here. And the outcome, firm performance, does in fact take place in a competitive market, right? So if I am a cyber cafe owner somewhere in Kenya, I'm competing with the other owners of the other cyber cafes in the town where I'm located. So we want to measure in this project the impact of giving small, medium business entrepreneurs in Kenya access to generative AI. In order to do that, we needed to have a generative AI-based tool to actually give them access to. And so we developed what we call the AI Mentor. The AI Mentor was built on top of GPT-4. We didn't do any fine-tuning, so this is pretty much just off-the-shelf GPT-4 as of mid-2023. That being said, we did a lot of prompt engineering during a pretty extended piloting process. I have the prompt over here on the right. It's probably too small for anyone in the room to read, but it's in the appendices of the paper if you'd like to take a close look. But to summarize what this prompt is doing, it's doing a few things. First, it instructs the AI to always give 3 to 5 actionable, easy to implement pieces of advice to the entrepreneurs. Second, it reminds the AI to tailor that advice to the business in question and to the context of Kenya, right? So we don't want to be recommending that these entrepreneurs go to Sand Hill Road to get more VC funding. And finally, it structures the responses in a way that participants can drill down on individual pieces of advice. So think almost about the menu that you would get if you called into a customer service line, where the AI might say, here are 3 pieces of advice: loyalty programs, pricing, marketing, getting out there in the community. They each have a number next to them, and the entrepreneur can simply respond with that number in order to get more information. The way that the participants in our study accessed this AI Mentor was through WhatsApp. Internet access in Kenya is extremely common. Most people have access to high-speed internet. And among those that do have access to high-speed internet, 97% of them use WhatsApp regularly. So we chose to allow people to interact with the AI Mentor through WhatsApp because this is a familiar way of accessing information and communicating with people for the folks in our study. So let me show you a few examples of what this AI Mentor actually looks like in practice. These are all examples that are actually taken from our data. So the first one of the entrepreneurs asked, can you calculate for me an estimated budget for 4 Friesian dairy cows and half piece of land and the possible risks that I might encounter? This is a query that I myself am not prepared to answer well. I don't know anything about Friesian dairy cows, but the AI Mentor was able to answer it pretty decently. So it sort of says, let me calculate an estimated budget for you. Here's a simplified breakdown of that budget. You should think about the cost of the cows. Here's an estimated number. Here are the feeding costs, veterinary care, so on and so forth. Here are also the risks: disease outbreaks, feed price, so on and so forth. No one on our co-author team, it turns out, is an expert in Friesian dairy cows. But we ran this response by someone who was in Kenya, and it turns out that these numbers and these back-of-the-envelope estimates are pretty reasonable. So at least one piece of anecdotal evidence that the AI Mentor is providing pretty good advice. Another example, I have a fast food joint that I run just adjacent to a Matatu terminus. Matatu terminus is kind of like a bus station in Kenya. There are several such food joints at that particular place, and it's fair to say that competition is stiff. How can I overcome the competitive business environment and be ahead of the rest of the pack? Again, here's the advice that the AI Mentor is giving here in this enumerated list structure that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. So here's a few ideas: differentiate the menu, improve customer service, implement a loyalty program, so on and so forth. Here's what this would look like in WhatsApp, just in case you really need to see it to envision it. And you can see here that in this particular case, suppose that the entrepreneurship wanted to learn more about option 3, which is the loyalty program. They can just respond with the number 3, and then they're given another layer of suggestions specific to loyalty programs. So maybe you want to know more about point-based systems, special offers for regular customers, so on and so forth. Suppose that the entrepreneur, in this case, wanted to know more about referral programs. They could again respond with 4, but if they wanted to ask about something that was not loyalty programs, they could just ask another natural language question. So that's kind of how the prompt is structured. One last example here. Hello, I'm a small business owner. I wash cars and motorbikes. I do this alone, but I find it tiresome. I want to employ people, but I'm worried about experiencing losses if I do so. So how can I monitor my staff and make sure that I get maximum profit from the business? And again, we see that the AI Mentor is offering pretty good advice. Like, I teach MBA students, and these are sort of the types of concepts that I might teach to those MBA students in class. All right, so that's the treatment group. We give people access to this AI mentor. The control group, you might naively think would just be to do nothing, but that is not what we did. So the control group in our experiment, the entrepreneurs, were given access to a PDF guide on how to run a successful business in a developing economy. There are two reasons that we did this. First, the entrepreneurs in the treatment group were sent periodic reminders to engage with the AI mentor. We wanted to make sure that what we were picking up was a treatment effect due to access to the mentor, not a treatment effect due to the reminders. So we wanted to have something to remind people in the control group to do. Second, we're going to end up getting our outcomes, which are profits and revenues, through surveys. We worried that if only the treatment gets something, then we might be picking up demand effects in the treatment group, right? So the entrepreneurs know they've been given access to something. They sort of intuit that we're hoping to see their fortunes improve, and so they artificially inflate the numbers when they respond. In this case, if that's happening, if we assume that that inflation is common across the two different groups, then we don't need to worry about that. This, it turns out, is a pretty effective placebo, we think, this PDF. Past work finds that there's no impact to just giving people a PDF telling them how to better run a business, which is, I guess, if you think about it, it makes sense. Just giving people a PDF, why would you think that would help? We recruited people for the study through Facebook ads. So we showed these ads throughout Kenya. The only restriction that we had on the ads is that the people that were shown the ads had to be over the age of 18. On the left here, you see what the ad looked like. Not the most beautiful ad that you've ever seen on Facebook, but it was effective at recruiting people to our study. After clicking on the ad, individuals were redirected to the first of 3 pre-treatment Qualtrics surveys that we delivered over the course of a couple of months. The purpose of these pre-treatment surveys were as follows. First, we wanted to screen out people that did not follow certain criteria, right? So we don't want people who don't actually own or operate a business. We didn't want people that were likely to attrit during our experiment. So we sort of collect some data before the experiment. We can filter out those that are likely to just fall off and stop responding. And finally, we can do attention checks in each of these different surveys and filter out people that are going to be inattentive during the experiment. For these pre-treatment surveys, and then also the surveys after the treatment is delivered, we are compensating people in both the treatment and the control group for their responses. So this is the timeline of the experiment. We started recruiting on May 21st. Here are these 3 pre-treatment surveys that I just mentioned. On August 21st, we sort of locked in our pre-registration on OSF, and that's when we actually randomized people using the stratified randomization scheme between the control group and the treatment group. We did that stratification on gender and pre-treatment business performance. And then we monitored outcomes over the course of 2 months. Is it 2 months? Let's say, 2 months over the course of 4 surveys, and then we ended the experiment on November 5th. Because of that sort of pre-treatment surveying that we did here, the attrition is really low in the experiment. So 97% of people that start the experiment finish the experiment, and there's no difference in attrition between the control group and the treatment group. So that's kind of the setup of the experiment. Now let me show you what we actually found. So all these other studies that have looked at the potential economic impacts of generative AI have found positive impacts of giving people access to generative AI. So the writers, the call center workers, the management consultants, they all became more productive and better at their jobs when they were given access to generative AI. In our context, we don't see that. So overall, we see a null effect, no overall effect on the business performance of the entrepreneurs in our sample. But we had a few different pre-registered dimensions of heterogeneity with respect to which we looked for heterogeneous treatment effects. One was prior ChatGPT usage. We did not see any heterogeneity there. One was gender. Again, we did not see any heterogeneity there. But we also looked at pre-performance or pre-treatment business performance. And there we do see some interesting heterogeneity. First, we saw that people that were in the initial low performer group, so people whose businesses were performing below the median, were actually hurt by giving them access to this generative AI-based tool. Whereas people that were in the pre-treatment high performer group were helped by being given access to the generative AI-based tool. And when we actually test for a significant difference between these 2 different HTEs, that difference itself is statistically significant. So as I mentioned, this is a different story than you're seeing in a lot of these other studies. Not just that there is not an overall effect, but all these different studies, the Delacqua paper, the Brynjolfsson paper, the Zhang and Neu paper, they all also find heterogeneous treatment effects with respect to pre-treatment performance, but those heterogeneous treatment effects tend to point in the opposite direction. So generally the finding is that generative AI does not help the high performers all that much. After all, they're already high performers, whereas it takes the low performers and brings them closer to the performance of the high performers. This is exactly the opposite of what we find in our study. And so the natural thing to do is to ask why. Why is it that we're finding something opposite to what these other papers have found? And that's what I'll spend the rest of the time today sort of explaining to you. So we looked first at the volume of question asking between the different cohorts. We didn't see any difference there. We then also looked at the types of questions that they asked. So we used AI to try to look at, categorize the questions in the categories and see if there were any differences in the distributions across those categories. Again, we didn't see any difference in the types of questions that people were asking. But then in our end-line survey at the end of the experiment, we asked people about what they had changed in their business. And so that allowed us to see not only what types of questions they had asked during the experiment, but what did they actually go on and implement over the course of the experiment. And when we look at those end-line responses, we start to see some differences. So I'm going to describe it in broad strokes as the high performers picking good suggestions and the low performers picking bad suggestions. And let me explain exactly what I mean by this. One thing that we see is that the high performers more often seem to be integrating AI and ChatGPT into the things that they changed about their business. So we see overall there's a big lift in people mentioning AI in the end-line survey, but that's being driven by people in the high-performing group as opposed to the low-performing group. And if we look at the words that are showing up in the actual responses in that end-line survey, the high performers tend to be using more tailored or uncommon words. So they're using words that seem to be specific to their business. So if I go back to this first slide I showed you, does this have a, no, it does not have a laser pointer. But you see in these responses, someone has a cyber cafe. You see in the response something about gaming accessories. Someone runs a chicken farm. You see something in the response around chicken feed or the coop. So you can tell that they're implementing changes that are actually specific to the business that they're running. Whereas in the low-performing group, people seem to choose what I'm going to call bad suggestions. What I mean by this is that they're more likely to drop prices and pay for advertising. So these are not specific recommendations to the particular business that they're running. They're just kind of generic pieces of advice that you might give anyone. And so you see words on the right-hand side in the AI-treated group like discounts, advertising, discounts, new products, like lower prices, way more often than you do in the control group. So one way to think about this is that this task selection story is really important when you're giving people access to AI in these more open-ended settings. The AI is always going to provide advice that is sort of distributed in terms of the actual quality of that advice. And so a really important complement to actually using AI effectively as a worker is being able to sift through the advice and tell which advice is good and which is bad. So in the context of our experiment, advice like renting new gaming accessories is actually a positive ROI piece of advice, whereas something like discounting your prices is on the lower end of that sort of distribution of advice quality. All right, let me quickly wrap up here. So what does this teach us about AI and innovation and entrepreneurship? First, it does suggest that AI advice can actually be impactful to help entrepreneurs in their business. So like in general, in prior entrepreneurship mentorship studies, you might wonder how much the advice itself actually matters versus sort of network effects and things like that. It does seem like the advice matters, and the advice does sometimes lead people down the wrong path. This is also true of human advice. The fact that we see positive advice for at least some people, or positive effects for at least some people in our study is encouraging, I think. It's just that if you sort of harness this advice in the right way and maybe refine what the tool is doing, you could see a positive effect across a broader range of entrepreneurs. Another finding is that the impacts of AI in these really specific controlled environments might not be the same as the effects of AI in sort of more open-ended loose environments. And there are potentially broader implications of these results as well, thinking about how firms scale up. Do they maybe need less talent to do so? Do the constraints on businesses change when they're around advice and learning, when they can access advice literally in their pockets? So that's what I had. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and look forward to your questions.
This is such a fascinating study, and I'm just wondering if you plan to do future studies, for instance, educating entrepreneurs how to best use AI so that they're implementing the good suggestions and not the bad suggestions.
Yeah, great question. So one thing I didn't mention is that we do give people advice in the study around how to ask questions, not around implementing advice. And it's a very brief training. So we basically say, here's an example of a good question, be specific, provide details. Here's a bad one, it's very generic. In terms of follow-ups, so not training with the AI per se, but Nick, who is a PhD student who's on the job market this year, he's great. He kind of led the study. His job market paper is actually a follow-up on this study. And one thing we found that is kind of not part of this main narrative is that when you give people AI, we observe that their social networks actually contract a little bit. So it seems like they're seeking less advice from human peers and mentors and just going to the AI as a substitute. And so in his follow-up job market paper, he kind of cross-randomizes access to the AI tool with access to a human mentor. And what he finds is that when you sort of combine the AI mentor with the human mentor, you get uniformly positive effects, and those positive effects are larger. And the story there is that the human mentor is able to kind of help the entrepreneur in this case sift through the different pieces of advice that are offered and sort of say, yeah, like that's a good piece of advice, that other piece of advice, not so good, don't follow that one. So, that ends up being a pretty high overhead intervention because you still need the human mentor to kind of do that override role, but presumably training the entrepreneurs from the start to be able to differentiate between good and bad advice might also be effective. Thanks.
I guess, hi, I'm over here. Two questions. One, I guess, just a little technical, and then one substantive. So when you find the heterogeneous effect, the 1 out of the 5, and it goes the opposite direction from the literature, you worry a little bit, it's still not real. So I'm just wondering if I know it's pre-registered, so you're testing a few hypotheses and whether or not those standard errors are adjusted or not, I'm just interested to know. And then on the kind of the going and looking for the ex post, what might be accounting for it if it is real. A thing that you might do, it's not causal, but it'd be descriptively interesting, I think, to back up this story you're telling about the people who follow the good advice versus so you're showing us that following the good advice is correlated with the pre-treatment high performers. It'd be interesting to know within those two groups, if I look in the pre-treatment good performers, is it in fact among them, not just that correlation, but is it inside that group, the ones who are taking the specific advice, who are the ex post high treatment effect, and within the pre-treatment low performers, this is the ones who are following the general advice, who are you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. So let me answer them backwards. So in terms of the second one, that's a great idea. I don't think we've actually done that to sort of look within the two groups. On the first point, we did do correction for multiple hypothesis testing, and the heterogeneity results survive when we do that. In terms of the overall null, we don't have the most power in the world, but we sort of ex post calculated the minimum detectable effect size, and we reject effects of the size that these other studies have found. So that doesn't mean that our results are guaranteed to replicate, but we've done what we can, and they seem fairly robust.
I'll go quick. I'll follow up with some questions later on, but I'm back here, sorry.
Hey.
This fascinating study, I think I have a couple questions about sort of the generalization and the comparisons to these other studies outside of the region. I think there's a number of specifics to the Kenyan context that could be affecting these things. So I'm just curious about sort of one question would be, do you think by running a lot of these pre-studies and kind of eliminating low performers, is the low performing group really representative of low performers in the larger market, or is it low performing amongst people who are willing to participate in these studies over time? And then second would be sort of the competitiveness of these markets in low and middle income countries. Do you think that has something to do with the quality of the feedback? Is it just less possible to differentiate between these types of groups and these types of markets? Those are my two questions, but great paper, appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Again, I'll try to answer your questions in reverse. I think, so I will admit that, or I should say, among our co-author team, I think everyone else sort of does a lot of research in developing economies. That is not really my forte in the group. I'm more the new technologies guy. So questions related to the Kenyan context, I'll give you my best possible answer, but it might be not a good answer, I don't know. But my sense from talking to my co-authors is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of running these businesses in Kenya, like pieces of advice that we would consider extremely obvious when you're actually in the field. If you give it to these business owners, they're like, wow, I never thought of that about that. That's like so amazing. So I think the markets are very competitive, but there's actually a lot of potential to give advice and have it be highly effective. In terms of the pre-treatment surveys, so I don't think our surveying is taking out low performers. I mean, it's taking out people that don't own businesses. It's taking out people that are likely to attrit. And I suppose you could argue that those that are likely to attrit are maybe those that are more likely to have low-performing businesses that die. That's one potential way that we might be filtering out some low performers. And then it's just filtering out sort of people that fail attention checks. So we're not filtering out any type of businesses in particular specifically. Given that we incentivize people with payment to complete the surveys, I think if anything, the concern that folks sometimes have is, are you getting people that are really enticed by this 30 Kenyan shilling incentive? And you would think those would be people who are maybe on the lower end of the performance distribution who really need the money. So I think the other concern that people often have about sort of representativeness and generalizability is the fact that we are recruiting on Facebook and et cetera, and so it's like how representative of the country of Kenya even is our sample. I think that's a valid question, but you can also imagine the people that adopt these technologies are likely to be the people that are very online and sort of like using WhatsApp, using Facebook. So, but they're good questions. I appreciate the question.
Okay. Super interesting paper. I was curious about the part of bad advice by the AI mentor, and I was wondering if you guys were concerned or found evidence of perhaps hallucinations. And part of what I'm asking this is because I have had the chance to chat with some business owners trying to implement AI, and sometimes trying to increase efficiency, but sometimes it has backfire. Actually, sometimes they're raising the gains that they obtained to begin with. And so, say there is existence of potentially black swans, like very bad advice at the very end of distribution, but you get that draw, and suddenly just it's a fatal advice. So, like, how can we think about this going forward about the potential for bad advice from these from AI?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't know that we've tested super rigorously for hallucinations per se, but I think the fact that in general the advice that's being given by the mentor here is not it's not being asked sort of like factual questions, it's being asked for advice on topics. And so I think it's a little bit harder for it to hallucinate. Like I think that's part of the reason we haven't really checked is it's hard to know if the advice is really bad or good without knowing really intimately the specific details of the entrepreneur's situation. But I think it's an important question that's worth thinking about, especially given that there's some research showing that, because of the training corpora of these models, maybe they don't do as well in, sort of developing economies and things like that. So it's something to think about for sure.
I have a related question, which is the degree to which you think some of these things might be industry specific. So whether ChatGPT would be giving really, really good advice to like food stall operators, but really, really poor advice to niche manufacturing, because some of these are low data quality environments, and so you'd be more likely to get bad advice in certain industries compared to others. So I'm curious if you would do a comparison where you would control, or it would be a structured comparison within specific industries.
Yeah, great question. So one thing I'll say, and I guess this is generally true of heterogeneous treatment effect analyses, is that even between the low-performing and high-performing groups, the industry distribution across those two groups is different. So it's possible that industry is driving the difference in sort of the low and high-performing groups, and we can't really determine what exactly we can attribute the heterogeneous effects to. We tried looking specifically at effects within industry, but given our sample size and the number of industries, we end up being underpowered in every different industry bucket. So I think it's a good question, but it's just beyond what we can answer with our data.
Yeah, I stole Peter's mic. All right. David, really interesting. Thank you. Kind of reminiscent a little bit of research on internet, right? For a long time, we're looking at the digital divide, access, and then the conversation shifted to actually divides in skills. You can have access, but you may not know how to use it properly. So I think this is quite interesting. I guess one question I had is, what do you think are the mechanisms connecting linking low performance businesses with poor selection of advice? Because that seems to be kind of the crux here. What is it about those entrepreneurs that makes them less skilled at using the ChatGPT mentor? And in some ways I would have expected education to make a difference. I don't know if you find that. I can't remember if that was one of the moderators or not. So what is it about those businesses that leads in that direction? I guess the other question: were the prompts translated from Swahili, or were they initial? Because it was remarkable how sort of eloquent the prompts were, and it's almost really sophisticated language in some ways. So I'm just wondering whether that is a proxy in some ways for the education level of the entrepreneurs themselves and industry, et cetera.
Good questions. So in terms of the language question, when we were piloting the tool, we checked to see if it worked in Swahili as well as English, and it did. But as it turned out, almost everyone in the sample engaged with the mentor in English. And so maybe that says something about our sample, that we were getting small business owners that were mostly engaging in English. But my sense from talking to Nick, who's done a lot of work in Kenya, is that most Kenyans, can speak pretty well in English. So I don't know to what extent you can really think about that as being representative of like a non-externally valid sample or something like that.
Extraordinarily sophisticated language for somebody who's doing like a small
Yeah,
business
yeah,
and selling
totally.
some food on the street.
In terms of the second question, yeah, I mean, we've tried to start digging around to sort of understand the mechanisms. I don't know that we have great answers. As I mentioned earlier, I think this sort of social network story is one piece of the puzzle. Another thing that we have, let's see. So we looked at the effect of the access to the mentor on a bunch of different management practices, and as you can see, we don't see it's a lot of nulls, but we did see some interesting results around time management ability and things like that. So that might be part of the story as well. So again, I would say that just based on power, this is something that's a little bit beyond what we can answer with our data, but I think it's a really natural sort of next step for follow-up studies. Thanks for the questions.
So you guys are thinking about treatment as having given them basically like a business class, but I'm wondering if you actually just gave them an accounting class. So suppose there was a common shock that affected all these people that depressed earnings, and the ones that got the treatment are just kind of better at keeping track of their losses or better at keeping track of their expenses. And that could manifest as this negative treatment effect, even if the treatment actually helped them out a little bit or had no effect. They're just better at recalling the fact that, oh yeah, I paid for the vet for my Frisian dairy cow. And they're not better business strategists, they're just slightly better accountants.
Yeah, that is interesting. I suppose that's possible. I will say that if you look at the sort of time trends across both the treatment and control group and within these above and below median splits, they're all increasing over the period of our experiment. So that's not to say that there isn't some shock that's affecting them all in some way, but it's not that they're all being hit negatively and some are accounting better than others. The other thing that, I don't know if this directly gets at the possibility that you're raising, but it's related, is that the outcome that we're actually using as our outcome variable is an average of the weekly and monthly profits and revenues. So it's kind of taking all four of those things and creating an index. And the reason that this is done is because there's an assumption that there's going to be accounting mistakes and sort of, they're going to give inaccurate answers. And so the thought is if you kind of average over four different noisy estimates of how the business is doing, you're going to get something that's a little bit more accurate. So I don't think we completely rule out the possibility of some kind of, this isn't about performance, it's about accounting or something. But I think that maybe helps to reduce the probability by a little bit, in that if it's just that they're getting noisier but not biased, I think it would help. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to David.